Imagine a human being who has never once lost sleep over money, never checked an account balance with a knot in their stomach, never borrowed against a future they were not sure would arrive, never felt the low-grade, nameless anxiety that hums underneath modern life like a frequency you cannot quite locate but cannot quite escape either. That human existed. For hundreds of thousands of years, they were the only kind of human that existed. And they were not poor. They were not desperate. They were not surviving on luck and desperation at the edge of extinction. They were, by almost every measure that matters to the human nervous system, more financially at ease than most people alive today. They woke up without debt. They moved through their days without obligation to any institution. They ate, they rested, they contributed to the people around them, and when they needed something they could not provide for themselves, the group covered the gap. Not as charity, not as a loan. As the natural order of things. This is not a fantasy. This is the documented economic reality of Homo sapiens for the overwhelming majority of our time on this planet. Here is what makes it even more remarkable. In 1972, economic anthropologist Marshall Sahlins analyzed the daily lives of surviving hunter-gatherer societies, groups whose way of life most closely mirrors that of our prehistoric ancestors, and published findings that upended everything economists thought they knew about early human life. He called these people the original affluent society, not because they had more, but because they worked between 3 and 5 hours a day to meet all of their material needs. The rest was spent in rest, in storytelling and play, in the deep social connection that held their communities together. Sahlins called it the Zen road to affluence, a life structured not around accumulation but around sufficiency, not around more but around enough, no mortgage, no credit card, no student loan, no overdraft, no minimum payment, no collection call, no number following them through their lives like a shadow they could never quite shake. And the system that made all of this possible was not primitive. It was not a lucky accident. It was a sophisticated, elegantly engineered economic architecture that had been refined over hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution. It had no banks, no interest rates, no creditors. What it had instead was something so deeply embedded in human biology that your brain is still running it right now, in every social interaction you have, whether you recognize it or not. It was called reciprocal altruism, and it was the original financial system. Evolutionary biologist Robert Trivers first described the mechanism formally in 1971. The principle is almost disarmingly simple. In a small social group where everyone's survival depends on cooperation, the most rational long-term strategy is not to accumulate privately. It is to give freely. You share your surplus today. Someone else shares theirs when you need it tomorrow. The obligation is real, but it is social, not financial. It is tracked not in numbers on a ledger but in the lived memory of a community, in reputation, in trust, in the quiet, unspoken understanding that what flows out from you will, in time, find its way back. Anthropologist Robin Dunbar spent decades studying the social structure of human groups and discovered that our brains are precisely calibrated for a community of approximately 150 people. Within that circle, everyone knows everyone. Every exchange is visible. Every act of generosity and every act of withholding is remembered. Reputation is not a social nicety in this world, it is currency. It is the most powerful financial instrument available to any member of the group. And in a world where reputation is currency, formal debt, anonymous, contractual, interest-bearing, enforced by an institution rather than a relationship, is not just foreign. It is structurally impossible. You cannot charge your kinsman interest on a borrowed tool. The social cost would undo you long before the debt ever could. This was the economic world your brain was built for. Now here is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Anthropologist and economic historian David Graeber spent years excavating the true origins of debt and published his findings in what became one of the most talked-about works of economic history in recent memory, Debt. The first 5,000 years. What he found demolished the story most people are taught about how money works. The conventional account goes, first came barter, then money was invented to make barter simpler, Then credit emerged to make transactions more fluid. Graeber's research showed this story was almost entirely a myth. There was never a widespread barter economy of the kind economists imagined. What came before money, what sustained human communities for the vast majority of our existence, was a gift economy, a living web of mutual obligation, reciprocal generosity, and social accounting that required no ledger, no enforcer, and no interest. The first formal debt, the kind recorded on a clay tablet, charged interest and enforced by a third party, appeared in ancient Mesopotamia around 3000 BCE, 5,000 years ago, in a species that has existed for over 200,000 years. Debt in the modern sense is not an ancient human invention. It is a recent one, a historically tiny experiment, and it appeared, Graeber notes, almost immediately alongside two things: temples and armies. Institutions of concentrated power, not communities, not families, not the reciprocal networks that had sustained human life since before recorded history. The moment debt became formal, it became a mechanism of extraction. And the moment it became extractive, it became the thing you and almost everyone you know is living inside right now. So what does any of this have to do with you? Everything. Because the gap between the economic world your brain was built for and the economic world you are actually living in is not just historically interesting. It is the source of a specific, measurable, and deeply underestimated kind of financial damage that most people never trace back to its real origin. Your brain, remember, was designed for a world where sharing eliminated risk, where giving freely was the rational long-term strategy, where accumulating privately was not just unnecessary but socially dangerous, a signal that you did not trust the group, which meant the group would stop trusting you. Hoarding in that world was not ambition. It was a kind of social suicide. Carry that instinct into a modern economy and watch what happens. The same impulse that made your ancestors give freely to secure their place in the tribe now makes you pick up the bill at dinner when you cannot afford it. The same social accounting that tracked reputation in a community of 150 now runs in the background of every purchase you make, monitoring how it looks, what it signals, whether it buys you belonging. The same reciprocity instinct that once built resilient communities now drives spending on appearances, on gestures of generosity, on the quiet performance of a financial stability you may not actually have. Because your brain is still trying to buy safety through social investment, even when the math does not support it. Behavioral economist Sendhil Mullainathan documented what this costs in his research on the psychology of scarcity. People living under financial pressure, people managing debt, watching balances, running the arithmetic of what is owed, and when experience a measurable reduction in cognitive bandwidth. The mental load of debt consumes working memory the way a background application consumes processing power. You have less attention for everything else, less capacity for long-term thinking, less ability to make the kind of patient, strategic decisions that actually build financial stability over time. Debt does not just cost you money. It costs you the mental clarity you would need to escape it. Your ancient ancestors never faced this particular tax on their minds. Their obligations were social, distributed, managed through community and conversation, and the natural rhythms of reciprocal exchange. No individual carried the full arithmetic alone. No one lay awake in the dark running numbers. You do. And the reason it feels so heavy, the reason the anxiety around debt feels existential rather than just mathematical, is because your brain cannot meaningfully distinguish between financial debt and social exile. They activate the same alarm system. They produce the same dread. Because in the world your brain was wired for, they were the same thing. Owing more than you could repay meant losing your place in the group. And losing your place in the group meant, in the most literal sense, death. The debt is modern. The fear is ancient. And the mismatch between the two is where most people's financial paralysis lives. Now here is where it gets specific. Understanding why your brain responds to debt the way it does not automatically dissolve it. But it changes the question you need to ask. Not how do I pay this off faster, but which ancient instinct is recreating the pattern that keeps generating the debt in the first place. Because for most people, the debt is not the root problem. It is the symptom. The tribal spending pattern, buying things to signal belonging, to perform generosity, to maintain status. Because your brain is still trying to buy safety through social investment. The scarcity panic pattern, making reactive financial decisions from a place of anxiety. The way a survival brain responds to perceived threat by acting fast rather than acting wisely. The invisible obligation pattern, taking on financial commitments because the social pressure to say yes feels as powerful, as primal, and as non-negotiable as any ancient tribal norm. These are not character flaws. They are the fingerprints of a brain doing its best in a world it was not designed for. That is exactly what the free financial bias checklist was built to surface. 10 psychological traps that map directly onto the ancient instincts described in this video. The approval trap, spending or committing financially based on what others will think, the modern version of buying belonging in a tribe. The panic trap, withdrawing, selling, or making reactive decisions under financial pressure, the modern version of a survival brain responding to threat. The invisible plan trap, having financial goals that exist only as a feeling, with no written number, no timeline, and no concrete next step. You check the ones that feel uncomfortably familiar. The discomfort is not judgment, it is recognition. And recognition is where every pattern that can be changed actually begins to change. The link is in the description. It is free. It takes 2 minutes. Most people who complete it see their financial life differently before they reach the final question. Ancient humans had no debt, but they were not free of obligation. They were bound to each other, by reciprocity, by reputation, by the quiet social contracts that made survival possible across hundreds of thousands of years without a single interest rate, a single creditor, or a single institution to enforce the terms. The binding was the point. It was the technology. It held human life together across a span of time so vast that everything we call civilization, money, banks, credit, debt, occupies only the final fraction of a single % of it. What you're navigating now is a system those people could not have imagined. A world of formal, anonymous, interest-bearing obligation that your biology was never calibrated for. A world where the debt is financial but the anxiety it produces is tribal, because your brain still cannot tell the difference between a missed payment and being cast out of the group. It never will. But now you know where the feeling comes from. And knowing is not just interesting. It is the beginning of asking a different question. Not how do I manage this debt, but why does the pattern keep recreating it? And what would it look like to build a financial life that works with the brain you actually have, the ancient, social, reciprocity-wired brain, rather than against it? Ancient humans had no debt. You do. But the distance between those two realities is not fixed. It is a set of patterns, and every pattern, once you can name it clearly, can be interrupted. If this video changed how you see your financial life, drop a comment below. Tell me which ancient instinct you recognized in yourself. Subscribe for weekly breakdowns at the intersection of psychology and money. The free financial bias checklist is in the description. Start there, and the next video is already waiting for you.